Hey everyone, Anarch here, and this is another episode of Anarch Abridged. This is part of a sort of lecture series, or a series of summaries, you might say, where I go over several of my video essays from the channel, including essays such as A Modern Anarchism, Power, Constructing the Revolution, and today's video is going to focus on A Modern Anarchism Part 3, titled Revolution. So that video covers a lot more than I'm going to be getting into here in this video. However, I just want to focus in on one part of A Modern Anarchism Part 3, and that is what I call the Revolutionary Roadmap. Now, it should be understood that historically, a lot of theorists have tried to avoid creating just such a revolutionary roadmap because they think it's too prescriptive. They're afraid of laying out a series of presuppositions which, when the material conditions come about, they're not going to take place. They're going to be different, and therefore all of our presuppositions will not apply to the circumstances that arise. However, now that we've seen the revolutionary outcomes of the 1800s, 1900s, and even the beginning of the 2000s, I think we can start to derive some rules of thumb about how horizontal revolutionary activity actually takes place. And so you can kind of see this revolutionary roadmap as being a sort of map of what the horizontal revolutionary outcomes have been in a variety of circumstances, trying to generalize those circumstances as best as possible to understand what commonalities and differences they have between each other. So we'll just jump straight into it. Let's take a look at that revolutionary roadmap. So here is the revolutionary roadmap. And you'll see that it's separated up into a bunch of squares with symbols inside of them. Each of these squares are what I'm calling a frame, and in each frame, certain conditions prevail. So let's zoom in on the very first of these. So in these illustrations, the triangle is a symbolic representation of hierarchical power, and the circle is a symbolic representation of horizontal power. Where a circle is inside of a triangle, then, it is a horizontal power structure trying to arise within a hierarchical power structure. The first frame, the one I have titled A1 here, is what I call Kyriarchal Stasis. So I haven't gotten into the meaning of this word kyriarchy within this series of videos. However, just understand that kyriarchy is the unified structure of all of the hierarchical power structures of a society sort of combined together, understood as one big machine where all of the pieces prop up all of the other pieces. So in this first diagram, what we see is just a triangle. And that's because what I'm attempting to represent here are the conditions where hierarchical power just has complete control, that it has destroyed all of the horizontal power structures within society. Now, of course, many people would probably mention that you can never really eliminate all horizontal power structures in a society, and that's true, but here what I'm attempting to indicate is that they don't have any power. They don't have any institutional power. They don't have any social power. At best, they only act to prop up all of the contradictions of the hierarchical power structure as it exists. One of the examples that comes to mind would be like the 80s and 90s in the United States, where there was essentially no horizontal power structures that had any real strength in American culture. And instead, hierarchical power really just had control over everything. It was the absolute default in society. So this Kyriarchal stasis is something that doesn't generally last very long. It usually collapses into one of these later frames in time. However, it could theoretically last for a very long time. For example, many feudal and monarchic societies lasted within Kyriarchal stasis for an extremely extended period of time and were only then subverted by things like guilds or peasants' rebellions. Ultimately, the thing to understand about this frame is just that Hierarchical power structures wish to return to this frame in all the other frames we're going to be inspecting, because this is the frame where revolutionary activity is non-existent and the system essentially has an absolute stranglehold on everything in society. So if you are in a society that is in Kyriarchal Stasis, what should you do? Well, what you should do is begin creating horizontal power structures. And this is assuming, of course, that your Kyriarchal Stasis is not so militantly suppressive that it will just destroy whatever the horizontal power structures you create are. However, even under those occasions, you can usually fly under the radar, even in Kyriarchal Stasis, and you can create all kinds of things which do not appear revolutionary at their base, but indeed can build up to revolutionary bodies as you proceed. As you begin to build these horizontal power structures, and especially as they start to see some proliferation within your hierarchical society, then you will actually be exiting this frame, and we will analyze those conditions in a moment. However, I will also just make a few notes that if you're in an incredibly suppressive society, you probably want to do things like creating mutual aid organizations or unions or workers' councils. I'm not going to tell you precisely how to build these horizontal power structures within your conditions. I'm just going to note that you don't need these bodies to be out and out, openly militant anarchist bodies. It's usually more useful, in fact, to create bodies which are just there for consciousness raising and have a broader, more libertarian socialist thrust, or even more vague than that, you might just say you are a horizontalist organization. And I should make note before I move on to the next frame that one of these horizontal power structures that can fly under the radar of hierarchical power structures a lot of the time is the reading group. I think it's because hierarchical power structures don't usually see the reading group as being much of a threat. However, it can be a great place to rally everyone together under a common ideology and to begin a radical education together. But moving on to the next frame, the frame I have labeled here as A2 is actually what I call catalysis. So in catalysis, those horizontal power structures we discussed are actually beginning to form. This is what happens if you move out of Kyriarchal Stasis. You see that green arrow that is connecting these two frames. Green arrows indicate the paths we should proceed on, and the black arrows represent where hierarchical power has succeeded in pushing us back, or where we have failed to move forward and therefore fallen back into a previous mode. So it's appropriate, of course, that the green arrow takes us from Kyriarchal Stasis to catalysis. In catalysis, we are assuming that these horizontal power structures have gotten a foothold and that they are not being actively suppressed. This is sort of like the seed germinating and the sprout coming up out of the ground. In this period of time, hierarchical power has not yet started suppressing this horizontal power structure. This suppression takes place in the next frame, which you might be able to see just a little bit to the right here, A3 or Emanation. In this frame, what we see is horizontal power structures being allowed to continue to grow without being actively countervailed by hierarchical power. This is actually the frame that I would say the vast majority of people are in. The vast majority of people are not in Kyriarchal Stasis. Kyriarchal Stasis, as I said previously, really does not last very long. And a lot of people I talk to, when I first talk with them, they are under the impression they are in Kyriarchal Stasis. But what I ask them to do is then go on a fact-finding mission, trying to find out if there are horizontal power structures of some kind, a horizontal organization, or a reading group or something, which already exists. And almost always they discover that one of these groups already exists and they just didn't know about it. What that means is that they are not in Kyriarchal Stasis, they are in catalysis. And I think this is where the majority of the planet is right now. So the conditions of catalysis, as I've noted, are where the government is not actively, militantly, aggressively countervailing these structures. Now, obviously, that is something we expect to take place as our horizontal power structures grow, but in general, hierarchical power structures do not rush to destroy these little nascent or embryonic horizontal power structures. They don't really see them as a threat in this stage. And we can see that this is the case even in places like the United States, where the US government, much as it may not like these horizontal power structures, it's not doing a lot of concerted activity trying to dismantle them at the moment. And that's because many of them have not risen to the level that they are an actual threat to the government. Now, that might sound like a criticism, but it's actually more a benefit. In fact, these are valuable strategic conditions. When the hierarchical power structure does not realize that something that seeks to destroy it is rising within it, something that may eventually become a threat, that means it gives it more and more time to grow. And we should be seizing this opportunity where we do not have to go into open, active conflict with the mega machine, as I call it, and instead we can just grow and accumulate power into these horizontal power structures. That is to say, catalysis is actually one of the most strategically advantageous positions for us to be in. Even though we have not gotten any leverage in this period of time, this is a period of time where we can kind of grow freely and experiment without being actively suppressed or imprisoned or even killed by the government. So what that means is you should take advantage of this position as much as is conceivably possible. See it as an opportunity to build up the power of the horizontal organizations that are present and an opportunity to create new ones that may go on to seize the moment. Now, it would be nice if we could stay in this period of catalysis until we had a superior force to destroy the hierarchical power structure that we are within. However, that is highly unlikely. Instead, it is more likely that if we grow to a sufficient strength within this period of catalysis, what will happen is that the state and capital and all of these other hierarchical power structures will indeed try to destroy us. And once that takes place, we are moving into the next frame. The next frame that I have labeled A3 here is what I call emanation. So you see I've got those little arrows going from the edges of the triangle to the circle. Well, those are just meant to indicate that the hierarchical power structure that this horizontal power structure is embedded within is beginning to countervail and attempt to destroy that horizontal power structure. Now, to varying degrees, you are almost always going to be in a kind of mixture between A2 and A3 because the system doesn't just one day decide now we're going to destroy you. Usually it's that they slowly begin ramping up their efforts. So you might say that as soon as you enter A2 or as soon as you begin catalysis, you're beginning to set forth the conditions that will lead towards emanation. That emanation is going to begin to show itself little by little in escalating attempts at destruction by hierarchical power structures such as the state, capital, white supremacy, and so on. So emanation, as I said, is kind of a gradation from catalysis. However, you are going to generally know when you're in this period of emanation because you are now going to be countervailed by a variety of hierarchical power structures. Not only the state and capital and white supremacy, as I said, but often other organizations that are about your size that are themselves more hierarchical. You'll find that as you become more of a threat to hierarchical structures writ large, you are also going to be seen as a threat to smaller scale hierarchical power structures. And therefore, you're often going to come into conflict with authoritarian organizations of a variety of different kinds. I should note, in this frame, we are not talking about civil war. Civil conflict is a different frame, which comes just after this one. This is instead the situation where all of these hierarchical power structures are beginning to escalate their aggressive efforts, but they have not gone to outright attempts at destruction. Or it should be said, if they are attempting to destroy the horizontal power structures that are rising within them, it has not risen to the level of a civil conflict. I think this frame represents the strategic conditions of a lot of people in a lot of different places on Earth right now. And I know I said that about Catalysis, but as I said, these are sort of gradated with one another. Usually the conditions that are taking place is that these horizontal power structures are allowed to grow, but they are being countervailed in a variety of ways by prevailing hierarchical power structures. I think a lot of horizontal revolutionary activity ends in this frame. Once hierarchical power structures begin trying to suppress that horizontal activity, then they're going to move back to the previous frame. And that is to say, they're going to neuter or co-opt or destroy that horizontal power structure until it is no longer a threat. And if they fully destroy it, they will move all the way back to the first frame, which let's pull that right back up. You see we have these black arrows. The black arrows take us back to frame A2, which is to say Catalysis. That's what happens if they co-opt those horizontal power structures, or those horizontal power structures themselves sort of become recuperated, or they simply weaken them and neuter them so that they no longer have any strength to grow. Or, as you see here, there's that other black arrow that takes us all the way back to Kyriarchal Stasis if they destroy that revolutionary horizontal power structure. So what we're attempting to do is we're trying to move with all of these green arrows and against those black arrows. Those black arrows, those benefit our enemy, and the green arrows benefit us. So as you can see, if you're looking at this, this branches in a few different ways. Back at Catalysis, we could have branched into what I call extended catalysis. Extended catalysis is where we have numerous horizontal organizations beginning to arise. And I know that may not seem like it's enormously different from just Catalysis, but it is. And that's because it then leads down into these other frames you see here. It opens up the conditions for horizontal power structures to either cooperate or come into conflict. We're going to get to that here in a moment. First, I just want to go down this first branch to the frame I have labeled as A4. So A4 is what I've labeled secession. Secession is the occasion where a horizontal power structure sort of removes itself from the hierarchical power structure. So this one, I would say, doesn't take place very often, but it does take place sometimes. I think the Zapatistas, for example, are a good example of this. What they've done is they have separated from the hierarchical power structure. Now, you'll notice there's still these arrows between the hierarchical power structure and the horizontal power structure. And that's because even after they secede, they're still going to be in conflict with that horizontal power structure. They're not going to get to just leave the hierarchical power and then go create a new society in the wilderness, or maybe not in the wilderness, as the case may be in some occasions, like Rojava, but instead, they are going to be in a position where they are still stuck in conflict with either the hierarchical power structure that they came from or other hierarchical power structures in their region. This is the beginning of actual open revolutionary conflict, because the hierarchical power structure is not going to just allow us to separate ourselves from it and begin to create our own autonomous region, having consumed that region likely from their territory. For that reason, we are probably going to enter into all kinds of different militant and violent escalation with the state and capital and other hierarchical power structures. This is also where we are now entering into the era of geopolitics. We are not only going to have to concern ourselves with the hierarchical power structure that we have separated from, we are actually also going to have to deal with other hierarchical power structures in the region who probably see us as a threat, and very rightly so. In my study, I think that this situation mostly arises when a horizontal power structure sort of leaves the main urban centers and goes out to more rural areas, or areas that have been largely neglected or left alone by the hierarchical power structure in that area. So that is the situation for both the Zapatistas and Rojava, for example. And you'll note that in both occasions, they are now having to enter an era of more concerted military conflict. For the Zapatistas, it is only now escalating, but for Rojava, it has been a fact of life for quite some time. So this method of secession is one method you can take. However, I don't think that this is necessarily accessible to everyone. I think this is largely going to be the outcome of circumstance. Instead, I think the situation we're going to end up in is that other frame that I skipped over. If you are in an urban center, I think it is very likely that what you should be doing is going from catalysis or emanation and to this adjacent catalysis that I mentioned a minute ago. That's because I find it is most necessary when you are in these urban centers to create numerous horizontal power structures that all meet people where they are at and satisfy people's needs within their own particular intersections. And it's also important because then it moves into this frame here that I call extended catalysis. So you'll note here in this frame, extended catalysis, we're going from having two of these horizontal organizations to now these horizontal organizations being federated together to now federations of horizontal organizations coming together. So this right here, this is more of a description of, for example, the C&T FAI in Spain. They didn't go that other path that I talked about where they seceded. Don't get me wrong, there was some aspect of this secession activity right here. However, that was mostly in the countrysides. In the urban centers, instead, they did this activity where they built up these organizations in the urban centers and they federated them together and they got bigger and bigger and bigger and formed a bigger and bigger power structure that was more and more of a threat. So the C&T FAI was actually going through two of these paths at the same time. That's probably part of the reason why that things worked out so well for them. In the urban centers, they did this extended catalysis, and in rural areas, they did secession. So extended catalysis is very powerful because you are building up numerous horizontal power structures that they have to defeat. They cannot just destroy one horizontal power structure. Now they have to destroy federations of horizontal power structures. And historically, we can see that is almost impossible for hierarchical power structures to do. Once you've got it built up that big, it is very, very difficult for them to defeat outright. Instead, they have to go through things like recuperation, or they try to co-opt it, or people within the organization turn it into a hierarchy. This frame right here, I think, is what most people in urban centers should be aiming for. However, I also want to note that during this period of time, you could end up in this frame I have labeled B2B, which is where you actually come into conflict with other horizontal power structures. And I call this self-sabotage. And that's because I think this is the most counterproductive frame in the entire flowchart. Coming into conflict with other horizontal power structures in your area is just doing the work of hierarchical power structures in your area. That's exactly what they would want to happen. The inability of horizontal power structures to practice solidarity with one another and to overcome their differences and to try to correct their mistakes is probably one of the most foolish things that we have normalized in the modern era. We have forgotten what solidarity is all about. And instead, we need to be focusing on trying to create federations of these horizontal power structures where we all come together and cooperate. Because if we do not, we may end up in this other frame I have here called megamechanical recolonization. So megamechanical recolonization is where one of those horizontal power structures becomes a hierarchical power structure. So I know this name, megamechanical recolonization, is kind of a mouthful, but if you actually watch A Modern Anarchism, the series, you'll know what I'm talking about with megamechanical colonization. But what I'm basically saying is that we are helping the hierarchical power structure of society reclaim a piece of its territory that it had previously lost, because one of our horizontal power structures has now become a hierarchical power structure, and hierarchical power structures at a miniature scale benefit the larger meta-scale hierarchical power structures of society. I should note, this frame is not just about our horizontal power structures coming into conflict. That was actually modeled in the previous frame. This frame represents the situation where one of our horizontal power structures becomes a hierarchical power structure. That can either happen by them being co-opted by authoritarian interests, or being recuperated by prevailing hierarchical power structures of society, but it can also happen by this internal horizontal power structure forming informal hierarchies by way of cults of personality, and because they refuse to formalize delegation and other functions. This can then place one or two people really at the top of the structure, and no one else is able to question anything. This can also take place in an informal sense through what is called a duocracy. In duocracies, quite often, the two or three people who do everything end up having all the de facto power because there are no formal decision-making systems. Because in formal decision-making systems, even those people who are not completely active, the people who are not every single day there doing all of the exact tasks, are also part of the deliberation and decision-making process. So this prevents the hierarchy from arising from a duocracy. However, these can very much still turn into hierarchical power structures. In fact, sometimes in consensus systems, if they are not watched closely, hierarchical entryists can turn them into hierarchical power structures. This is one of the worst things that could happen when we are carrying out revolutionary activity. It represents the movement backwards and a victory for the mega machine. But let's get into some of the spicier frames on this roadmap. So I talked about this situation called Emanation, where the hierarchical power structures of the society we're in are beginning to countervail us. However, we have to consider the possibility that our horizontal power structure could actually prevail in this conflict. And in this situation, we would end up here in this frame that I've called C1, or civil conflict. This frame, as it sounds, is going to be characterized by open conflict with the hierarchical power structure that characterizes society. This will also probably be punctuated by civil war activity where we are fighting with other people who are civilians within our society. This is an era of armed combat. There is no way out of it. If we end up becoming more powerful than the hierarchical power structure which we arose from, it will fight us to the death, and it will summon all of its geopolitical allies. So this frame is one that we often sort of romanticize on the left. We hope to get into this situation where we will be able, through force of arms, to simply overthrow the hierarchical power structures which characterize society. However, I just want to note that this is a very bloody method. It's actually, I would say, more bloody than that secession method, but it is the outcome of being stuck with the mega machine. That is to say, it's the outcome of being stuck within the urban centers where we can't really escape hierarchical power structures. We can't just disappear and begin forming things while they don't notice. We are going to have to form it right under their nose. And if we become more powerful than them, that's not something that's just going to go under the radar. We are going to end up in a struggle to the death with this slowly withering hierarchical power structure. that is going to be openly militant and will absolutely require for us to have militias and federations of militias and so on in order to crush the state and capital and white supremacy and all of these forces of reaction, which will absolutely arise within this period of civil conflict. And I should note, there are green arrows coming from two different places to civil conflict. That is to say, if you came here from Emanation, which probably took place because you got powerful enough back here in Catalysis, then you can go straight to civil conflict because your power structure is just enough to actually go to war with the hierarchical power structure. However, there's also a green arrow coming from here, extended catalysis. Extended catalysis is another situation where you are arising in the urban centers, and therefore you don't have this opportunity to secede and to just claim autonomy away from the hierarchical power structure. Instead, you are going to be forced into conflict with it. So if you can succeed in civil conflict, that means you enter into this frame here that I have labeled C2. C2 is autonomy. C2 and this other frame up here called A5 are actually identical. They represent autonomy. That is to say, you are no longer being actively countervailed by the hierarchical power structure that you arose from. You are able to sustain your own people. You've begun to develop what I call a horizontal hegemony. That is to say, horizontal society is now the absolute cultural default. And that means that you are able to then begin sort of solidifying your wins. This is where I expect that you would begin to see this sort of more than the sum of its parts behavior, this behavior of emergence that I discussed in one of the previous parts. I should also note, because A5 comes out of secession, this can also be the result of just successfully struggling for secession. So like if the Zapatistas or Rojava are able to get autonomy from, say, the Mexican state or the Syrian state, that will represent this A5 condition or the C2 position as I've located it here. I think there might be some particulars which will differ between these, but I would need to see more experimental data in order to discern the differences between C2 and A5. However, I think these C2 and A5 are basically what we are aiming for in the near-term future. These are achievable in decades. However, they are going to be very hard fought. They are either going to come through this period of civil conflict, which will be very brutal, or they are going to come through this period of secession, which will be very difficult. So either you go out into rural areas and you secede, or you come into open militant conflict inside of the urban centers, and you're probably going to end up having to do guerrilla combat in either of these in conflict with the hierarchical power structures of society. However, this frame of C2, this autonomy frame, is absolutely what we are aiming for. We are trying to create a sort of regional autonomy where we are no longer reliant on the hierarchical power structure, and the hierarchical power structure has had to concede our autonomy. That is no longer trying to destroy us, or if it is, it no longer has leverage to do so. We now have the ability to maintain our territory and to come into a sort of harmonious horizontal functioning. This right here, frames C2 and A5, this is actually what I'm talking about in the video after the revolution. A lot of people thought that in that video after the revolution, I was talking about some society where we had completely destroyed all of hierarchical society beforehand, and that I was laying out some sort of perfect utopia. That is not the case at all. Instead, what I was doing was laying out the conditions of this frame right here. And I mention that because in the video after the revolution, I'm kind of talking about a mixed system, a system where the entire market is controlled by cooperatives and federations of workers and consumers. and at the same time has an enormous decommodified sector. And a lot of people have brought up, like, why do you have this sort of mixed system? And the reason is because during this period of regional autonomy, before we've had some complete global revolution, we are going to be stuck trading both inside of our autonomies, between our autonomies, and with the rest of the world that has not yet become horizontal. And so that's how you should interpret what's happening in After the Revolution. I'm talking about that frame just after we have exited the era of civil conflict, or when our secession has been successful. I make this mention because this conversation about how would an anarchist society be structured, it's often hard to figure out exactly which of these frames they're asking about. Because a lot of the time when they are asking me what I think an anarchist society would be structured like, I'm talking about this frame, the frame right after we have defeated the hierarchical power structure that we originated from, and we now have a sort of regional autonomy. However, a lot of the time people get this mixed up with the next frame that I am going to look at. This next frame is what I call adjacent autonomy. So adjacent autonomy, which I have labeled here as D1, is this frame where we have begun to establish numerous autonomous regions that are all horizontal. In this period, we can now begin coordinating these horizontal regions with one another, which will build the power of all of those horizontal regions. And this is the period of time when we are going to begin to have leverage over the hierarchical power structures of society. Whereas the previous frames that I've laid out could probably take place in the course of just a few decades, I think that this era will probably enter us into that century mark and will probably endure past a century. We will probably be fighting back against hierarchical power structures, even the prevailing hierarchical power structures like the state and capital and so on, for a very long period of time, because they're not just going to go away. We are going to have to establish these autonomous regions in a variety of places if we ever wish to stomp out the forces of reaction globally. And I mention this because this is another one of those frames where the conditions are going to be different. So now that we have adjacent autonomy of all of these regions, we could actually begin to abolish a great deal of the market system, and we could actually then be able to subsume a lot of our internal relations into these sort of decommodified, communistic, direct distribution mechanisms. And I think that we can't do that before we have moved into this era, because we are still going to be stuck trading with all of these external entities. However, during this period, we are now going to be doing trade with probably mostly those other horizontal power structures. And that means that we can actually now begin trying out these new methods of distribution that don't require money and wages and all of these other things. So taking us back here, I just want to note, you'll see that there is this green line that is coming out of this frame. And you might be saying, well, where's that going? And the answer is it goes back over here all the way up to this, which that may not make sense because that frame, this adjacent catalysis frame, this was said to represent the situation where we are arising within a sort of regional hierarchical power structure. However, here's where I'm establishing a sort of iterative loop. This now represents the new scale. This is now the global scale, and the hierarchical power structure is that of the sort of global imperial hegemons, which we are now coming into conflict with. And so that means that because we are now stuck in this larger body, we're not going to be able to do secession again, right? We can't do secession for the same reason that you can't really do secession when you're building groups in the middle of urban city centers. Like in the urban city centers where we are stuck alongside these hierarchical power structures, like we will be once we go to the era of geopolitics, we are going to have to go through this process of cooperation, then federation, then federations of federations. Okay, you see that this models the same thing as when we arose in the urban centers. So unfortunately, that means that once we get to that stage, we are going to have to go to civil conflict. That's just the next thing that comes. We are going to have to go into a long era of protracted geopolitical warfare with those hierarchical power structures in society, and we hope that we end up here with leverage over those hierarchical power structures after we've done that adjacent regional autonomy that we discussed a minute ago. And so here, if we can carry this out, if we iterate this loop over and over and over at various scales, then we will eventually end up in a situation where hierarchical power structures have been defeated, and all that is left is horizontal power structures covering the face of the planet. Now, obviously, there will always be internal forces of reaction, and how will we treat them? Well, right back to this civil conflict. Civil conflict is how we deal with the forces of reaction. Hierarchical power structures try to arise, we destroy them. So, this is why I've often said anarchists are not against suppressing reaction. In fact, suppressing reaction, it's right here on the roadmap. There's no way to avoid it. It's just part of the process. Suppressing reaction is just what happens when horizontal power structures are winning over hierarchical power structures. But I hope that was a pretty good summary of the roadmap. There are a bunch of details I could have gotten into, giving people specific recommendations as to what they should do in any given one of those frames. However, I was hoping instead to just give an overview of what I am discussing in that flowchart. And I hope that flowchart is useful for you to be able to locate not only where you are in this process of revolution, but also where you need to be going if you're in the process of revolution. The flowchart itself kind of is recommendations about what you should be doing. Anyway, you can find this flowchart in the article version of A Modern Anarchism Part 3, which can be found on libcom. You can also find it being discussed in greater depth in A Modern Anarchism Part 3, titled Revolution. And if you want just a little more information on that one frame I laid out about autonomy just after the defeat of a hierarchical power structure, then you should go watch my video after the revolution. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that and found it informative. If you liked the video, go click like. If you disliked it, click dislike. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, etc., go leave them down in the comments. Let's start a conversation about this. Lastly, if you support the work that I'm doing here on this channel, you should go become a patron at my Patreon, which is patreon.com/anarch. You can become a patron for any amount, $2, $5, $7, $10, $20. Any of those amounts will be enormously helpful. They will also get you access to the Anarch Discord. If you want to get to the Anarch Discord, don't forget to just enter your Discord information in the settings of Patreon, and it will automatically integrate and give you the invite. Also, you can get access to the Anarch Discord through becoming a YouTube member. It will also get you an advanced viewing of several of the videos that I release if I upload them a few days ahead of time so that they can be scheduled to release later. You will see them when they are first uploaded, which that might be a perk that you enjoy. Lastly, don't forget that 5% of my monthly Patreon income, every time my Patreon gains from the previous month, I will donate directly to Cooperation Tulsa, which is a communalist and social ecologist organization in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But anyway, I think that's about it for today. I hope y'all enjoyed that, and I'll see y'all next time.